Okay, so here's one of the systems that we're using. So basically, animal manure is a great way in which you can start to create some fertility on your farm. Animal manure can come from cows, chickens, pigs, rabbits. Here we're using, and goats of course. So here we have goats and chickens, and we're starting to, we're incorporating their manure into a composting system. This pile was started also with cow manure to jumpstart the process. So basically what needs to happen is you take the manure and you're mixing it with different carbon materials. And the idea is that because the manure has different pathogens in it, it needs to sit and cure for a certain amount of time. This particular pile in active management reached about 150 degrees and goes through a cycle in which it reaches that threshold and then cools down again. You're adding water, you're initiating that heat again, and it cools down again. So depending on what manure you're using, there are different specifications on how often and how long you should manage the pile, and also how hot it needs to get to kill the pathogens. So we started this about, I think, in the beginning of the year, and we'll be able to use it pretty soon. So once it's sat long enough, gone through the appropriate heat cycle, you can then use it to amend any of the beds that you're using to grow food or to grow plants around the property. So for you to do this in an urban farm, it can be easily done in a smaller system. You can plan to designate a certain spot of the farm to accommodate this kind of composting, because urban farming can be intensive, and there's a lot of output. You have a lot of input when it comes to soil fertility. And so instead of buying a lot of compost, one way in which you can have a regenerative practice is to try to make your own compost as much as possible. So this is a good way. You can also get horse manure, cow manure, manure from other farms or other small farms by you, and make the compost yourself. If you have chickens in the urban farm, which a lot do, you can also use that manure, mix it with the appropriate material, and create that really dense, high nitrogen chicken manure compost, which is excellent for growing food. So this is just one example of the kind of composting system you can use. So Humanure is another way in which we are taking waste and creating new soil. Here's one of our composting toilets on site. You can see has a nice door. There's some directions, of course. The actual throne part. So Humanure may not be appropriate for the urban farm, but if you have a farm that's outside the urban city centers, could be a little more rural, and you're welcoming people, or if you're living on site, this is a great option. There's two ways to do this Humanure. The way that we have to do it here is by using buckets. You can see on the side over there. Basically, the waste is going into the buckets that's under the seat in there. You can see over there under that plywood. The buckets are in there collecting the waste. Anytime you use the composting toilet, we really only recommend just using it for number 2. Then, after you apply sawdust, the bucket is full, it gets taken out, and it cures. We're doing it for about a year of curing. Basically what happens is the manure, the waste breaks down, the human manure waste breaks down, kills the pathogens, of course, which is really important, and then can be used to compost, actually to fertilize any of your outlying plants in your perennial zones. Also can be used in orchards. The cool thing about also fruit trees is they often have the ability to filter through waste and any other harmful substances within the soil. And so if you're using a human manure that's cured, you can apply it as a fertilizer in those zones. I don't use it in veggie spaces, growing spaces. I do know some, I've heard of some farmers that do that, but we don't do that. We have other sources of compost like the chicken manure and worm castings, etc., that we use for the veggies and herbs and things like that. So perennial zones and orchards. The other way to do human manure is this whole composting toilet can be sitting over a dug-in pit about 6 feet down. We can't do that in this soil because the high desert soil does not have as much microbial life as, say, the Pacific Northwest, for example. So you can do this kind of composting, open pit, human manure in those kind of climates, zones, because there's a lot of microbial life that can come in and break down that human manure. And then when it's filled, essentially, you cover that big hole, that ditch. You move the whole toilet facility, this whole building, to a new location. So that way you're starting to build fertility in different pockets of your property. We don't do that here. We use the buckets that we can then disperse. So that's another example of composting. Okay, so behind me are two examples of just kind of like single pile wire bin, wooden bin designs. These can be really easily integrated into the urban farm. The idea is really simple, and in Citizen Farmer he goes over the steps. I'll include some other resources on the kind of like the step-by-step process. But basically, the cool thing about this design is that it has sections, so that when you start with the first section building your compost, you're starting with that really woody material, and then adding your greens and browns, and then as the compost pile grows, you keep adding layers so that it fits and keeps it contained. This method, the wire method, is a little bit more less intensive in the sense that you're probably not tending to it as much. This is kind of like you leave it, you throw your green material, add some brown material, and it can definitely heat up over time. It's a little bit less intensive, but you can get in there and turn it actively and keep it hot as an active compost. The same thing with this one. We had corn that we just took out, so I just put those there for now. But the idea with any kind of compost situation, it's better to break down the material as much as possible, chopping it, cutting it, snipping it. It gives more surface area and also easier for the decomposers to come in and break down all that material. One design that we don't have here on site is a 3-bin system. If you can imagine 3 bins like this placed next to each other, the idea is that as the compost progresses in curing, you move it from one station to the next. And again, I'll provide a resource that has step-by-step instructions for that. But visually, these are really easy to build and incorporate in the urban farm. Can also be very productive. Again, these are looking a little bit more dry. And also these are under the shade because our afternoon sun is on that side, and this tree helps provide some of that shade so it doesn't dry out as easy. Also, this is close to our kitchen, so I usually put a lot of scraps out here if it doesn't go to the chickens, of course. So super easy to maintain and a good design for the urban farm.